Okay, welcome to session 19, part D. I made a mistake at the end of part C. I said that wraps up part D when it was really part C, and I said I'll see you in part E. That was not true. I'll see you in part D, where we are now. Okay, so for part D, um, I want to go over some aspects in the book. Last section or two or three for talking about redistributing income. One is a simple point that um, this is on page 296 in the 13th edition. Just in case you don't have it, if you haven't bought the book or you have the 12th edition. So this is considered the hypothetical, but unfortunately not implausible case of a single parent, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So those two paragraphs. It talks about this hypothetical um, single parent. Suppose it's a woman. Make things easier for me to remember, at least. Single mom. And it says at the end, the kind of punchline, it says that amounts to a 90% marginal tax rate. Okay. That might not have been clear if you're reading this, and let me explain what was going on there. So, in this hypothetical example, there's a mom who starts off not working, but she gets 400 in cash grants. Used to be called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. I think it's called something new now. But anyway, that's just cash money that's the main component of welfare. Then also, let's assume she's getting $100 worth of food stamps. And then she's getting $50 in subsidized medical care. I presume that would be Medicaid. Okay, so the key is the total of this is 550. Okay, all right. Now, in the second case, where all of a sudden she gets a job, okay, what happens? She gets $1,000 per month in income, but she has $350 in expenses. Okay, what I'm calling expenses, they include first, as we talked about earlier. So $1,000 a month, that's about $12,000 a year. The standard deduction is about $12,000, which means she would be paying about zero in income taxes. However, she would be paying Social Security taxes. Okay, that'd be about 6% on her income. Which she wasn't before. So she's paying Social Security taxes, but also now she's working. She's as a single mom. She's got kids. Got to put the kids somewhere. They put them in daycare, and meanwhile has a new job. That's buy new clothes for the job. She's got to get to the job, transportation costs, and the book says it would be reasonable to say some of those expenses would be something like $350. So if so, her new income is 650. Her take home pay now is 650. Before, her take home pay when she was getting welfare was 550. Okay. By the way, once she gets the job, she loses all these benefits. So she gets the job. No longer does she get that. So her new take-home pay is just the salary minus expenses, 650. On net, her take-home pay has only gone up $100. Okay. But meanwhile, her salary for the job was 1,000. Okay. The gross pay was 1,000, but her take home pay, the extra take home pay from is only 100. So that's like 90% is being taxed. Okay, so it's not all that 90% is literally a tax. Some of it were things like expenses, but Some would say maybe those should be deducted from your taxes for this reason. But regardless, her take-home pay only goes up by $100. It's as if she is being taxed 90% of that $1,000 paycheck. And if you think about it, how many of us are going to work if we're being taxed 90%? And some may say, "Oh, the pride in working, I would still work." I probably wouldn't, but maybe a few would, but I think most of us wouldn't. And so the idea from that is that woman may not want to take that job. Okay, so that's what they meant by that 90% tax rate. Now, the second point of that example was that suppose we went the other way. Suppose I said it like we started off. The woman was on welfare and then went to a job. Suppose it went the other way. She had a job that was making $1,000, nice expenses and so on, but all of a sudden they said, "Hey, how would you like to be on this welfare system?" Most of us would say, "No, I'd prefer to do that." Okay, she would, if the welfare system is like this, she would, in all likelihood, switch, could quit her job and go to this welfare system. Now, what could happen is when we're looking at national income statistics, it's not clear what you would count, what the Commerce Department would count as her income. I'm almost certain it would not count the food stamps or the subsidized the Medicaid as part of her income. They might count that cash grants, but I'm not, maybe not, but let's assume they do. What would happen to this hypothetical woman? She would go from $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, to something like $480 a year. Excuse me, $1,000 a month, no, 4,800 a year. So she would be classified as going from something like lower middle class, depending on the year, especially if this were like in 1980s dollars, 12,000 is lower middle class. It'd be something like going from lower middle class to impoverished. Okay, even though you could still say actually she's better off. She would say, "I'm better off going from here to here," even though it looks like I've gone from lower middle class to poor. So the national income statistics would be a little bit artificial, but that's just part of the one unintended consequences of these poor programs. Sometimes they can make at least appear that people are becoming more impoverished from the program. So you got to be careful. As with a lot of things with policy, there are unintended consequences, and it's the job of the economist to think of what are those unintended consequences. Okay, so that was one point. I wanted to explain what's going on in the book, and especially wanted you to understand what they meant when they said the 90% tax rate. It's as if she's being taxed at 90%. Okay, next thing. So a number of aspects with poverty and inequality of income have to do with something like the following graph. Let's just say to keep things simple, there are 5 people, and person 1 has an income looks like this, person 2 like that, person 3, person 4, and person 5 like this. So this is the richest person, second richest, and so on. Okay. Now, often I think this is our intuition, is that if we're going to have a income redistribution program, what we want to do is tax the rich and give it to the poor. So if we can just lop off, take that money from the richest person, and if we can give that money to the poorest person, now all of a sudden their incomes are more equal. Okay, that's what we usually think about when we have these redistribution policies. Okay, that's the most intuitive case. but you have to be careful with that. So as we discussed earlier in this session in parts A and B, I talked about when Joe Rogan moved to Texas, when another case where the tax rates go up, people all of a sudden start doing all their own home repairs and home additions. They don't hire outside people. That reduces employment. Um, um, Also, sometimes can reduce the tax base for the government. So, what happens when you do these redistribution policies? You've got to increase taxes, especially on the rich. What happens often is they either move or go to the black market with their labor services, or um, just somehow start working less. Okay, when that happens, not only do you tax them, but their income goes down even more. Okay, so what happens is even if you give this money to the poor, you can cause the total income to drop. Okay, sometimes the net effect can be really bad. So, for instance, suppose this person had been hiring this person to do the addition. What happens is not only does this person's income drop, so does, say, all the other people that person might be hiring or buying from. So if so, you have this income is granted, but you lop off um, the income of all the others. So what could happen is, even though you've transferred some income from this person, what could happen is there's a total drop in the net effect. So I've made the net effect, it's that income is dropped but gained from the transfer. That's bigger than that. The net income is actually helpful in terms of making the poor better off. But you could imagine where that red number could actually be bigger. Somehow the income reducing effect for everyone is bigger than that amount you can transfer, and it could cause everyone to be poor. Okay. And so what would happen is you've actually increased poverty if that's the case. And lots of us think that something like that has happened in many of the communist countries. So if you look at the Soviet Union, when Stalin was dictator, there were massive famines in the Ukraine. There's a great movie that just came out called Mr. Jones. I encourage lots of you to watch that. There are people starving. And at least 10 million, it might have been 20 million people that were died from the Ukraine just from these policies, these communist policies, which in theory were ones to make income more equal. Didn't quite work. It decreased the income of the richest, but it's not clear that it helped the income of the poorest. Same thing with Pol Pot in Cambodia. North Korea today, people are eating bark. If you don't believe North Korea is poor, just go on the internet, look up over the satellite images of the lights that are on in North Korea versus South Korea. These drastic redistributionist schemes like communism often end up making the poorest people even poorer. Okay, so you have to be careful with these redistribution policies. And I'd argue also something like that's going on in Venezuela. Venezuela started these socialist policies, all started under Hugo Chavez. He called it the Socialist Bolivarian Revolution. This continued on to his successor, Maduro. But the result is that country has had a huge drop in income. It's something like their national income has dropped something like 60% over the last 5 or 10 years. Meanwhile, the Depression in the United States, national income only dropped by like 25%. So this is like 2.5 times the effect of our Depression, what's going on in Venezuela. And I'd argue the problem is these radical, at least the radical versions of socialism, can actually do the opposite of what it intended. So yeah, maybe it made incomes more equal, but it has made the everyone poor, even the poor. So you always have to be careful with those. And something like that has seems to have gone on in reverse in the U.S. So the book has various graphs, and it shows, for instance, that that poverty, okay, that poverty has actually been decreasing over the last several decades. So this is 12.2 percentage of families with income below the poverty line. So in the 1960s it was like 18%. 1950s, 1940s it was even greater than that. You get back to the 1920s, it's up to like 20 or 30%. But somehow the United States has prospered, and somehow the poverty rate went down to 8.7 in 2000, ticked back up in 2010, 11.8, but it's definitely much lower than it was in 1960, and much, much lower than it was in the 50s and 40s and 30s. Even though poverty has been decreasing, incomes have actually been becoming more unequal, and this is in table 12.1. So it looks like the opposite of the effect of what we've been talking about, that it's almost like you start decreasing tax rates. This allows the rich to become richer, but allows the rich to start hiring more people, the total income to expand. Looks like something like that might have happened. Regardless if that has, I want you to understand how it can happen. And this is related to those unintended consequences of the redistributionist policies. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. Let's see. Redistributing. Was there anything else? Just the final point. Let's see. They talked about one thing to be careful about when talking about distribution of income statistics is usually these things are expressed not in income per person, but income per household. And it's not clear why they should do that. Maybe they should, the Census Department should emphasize the income per person. And the idea is the following. If you just have two people, look like this, this is their incomes. Suppose that this is the poor household, okay? But in this household, each of these is a couple, okay? The richer household, man and woman, poor household, man and woman. But for some reason, the poor household, the man and the woman get divorced. Suppose in the result, their two incomes are the same, but they're just in two different households. And all of a sudden, what this graph would look like, we would make that bar graph half as high, but it's now two people. So now all of a sudden the incomes look even more unequal, even though everyone is still making the same amount of money. It's just that household broke up. And this has been a very significant phenomenon since the 1960s. Before 1960, very few babies, for instance, were born to a single parent. Now we're up to something like 65 or 70% of all babies are born to a single mother, which it was not that way in the 1940s. It was something like only 20%. So if that's true, that households are splitting up, and it's the case that the splitting up of households occurs more frequently in the poor households than the richer households, you're going to get inequality increasing, even if everyone's income is staying exactly the same, and it's just an artifact of the notion that we're using household income um, rather than individual income. So the book makes that point. So be careful when you see those statistics. And often people use them in deceptive ways. They won't mention that fact about the notion that households are getting smaller. But always keep that in mind when you ever see those statistics. Okay, I'm going to end there. Okay, so that was part D. Final part, E, I'm just going to go over some more questions from the back of the book. Okay, see you there.